I am a Muslim. I choose to cover, but I don't think you find me threatening. I don't think anyone should find me threatening because I follow the Constitution. I don't
Well,
put
I
anyone.
don't know. I don't know. You may have a gun on you or something, right?
Hello and welcome to another episode on TMJ's Political Current podcast. Today I am joined by Douglas Macgregor. He is a retired U.S. Army colonel and combat veteran, as well as a military analyst and political commentator. He's joining me today to discuss everything from the recent ICE raids happening here on American soil to U.S. foreign policy and America's continued funding of Israel and Israeli interests in the region, and ultimately whether that has protected American interests and truly made America more secure, both domestically and abroad. Thank you again, Colonel Macgregor, for joining us on TMJ News. Some of the recent news we're seeing coming out since early 2025, we've seen how ICE has conducted large-scale raids across major U.S. cities. And for example, there have been scenarios where over like 500 individuals were detained in one sweep alone. And one thing that we have seen is it's sparked concerns about wrongful arrests. Some of these people who have been arrested have also been U.S. citizens and veterans like yourself as well. I want to know your thoughts on. I know some of your thoughts on immigration, and I think it's valuable to delve into that as well. But I want to ask you what you think about this recent kind of the state of how ICE, especially, is handling this situation.
Well, first of all, I've been a huge critic from day one because I see no strategy. There has to be a strategy. And I like Tom Homan. He's a nice man. He's a good policeman, but he has no authority. He has no money. Lots of the sheriffs out there like him because he's seen as obviously helping them. I mean, I was in Texas and I've been in Arizona, and they're very grateful for the dramatic halt in mass immigration into their states. At the same time, they're very upset that most of these immigrants have not been turned around and shipped out again. And you bring up a very important point, which is race. The only people in the United States who think race doesn't matter are white people. That's the truth. Everybody who is not white thinks it's absolutely vital. I grew up in North Philadelphia. You stop any black man on the street, ask him, what do you think? Does it matter race or is it irrelevant? And he'll tell you flat out that being black is the number one thing in his life. That's the truth. We have been lying to ourselves, really, I would say since the end of the Second World War, but certainly since 1965, pretending race, religion, language, and culture don't matter. Well, they do matter. Put 100,000 Christians on the ground in Algeria or Saudi Arabia, and what will happen to them? They'll be slaughtered or driven out of the country. It's because it matters. It's this thing we call societal cohesion. Nations do not exist on their own. They have a core population. Our core population from the very beginning was always at least 80% European and Christian and about 15 to 20% African. But when you start bringing in huge numbers, millions, who are fundamentally different from the core population, you are going to get violence, anger, and conflict. How many times have you heard people say, if you bring people in from the developing world, what do you get? The developing world. And now we've got that. You can't bring in hundreds of thousands of people from Somalia, plant them, of all places, in Minnesota, and then be shocked that no, they're not Americans. They're not really interested in being Americans. They're foreigners living on American soil. Nobody wants to say that publicly. If you do, oh, well, you're a racist. Well, you know, the world is full of racists. The real war that's going to decide our fate is not going to be fought anywhere overseas. It's going to be fought right here inside the United States. Are we going to survive as a republic, as an English-speaking republic that rests on the foundations of Western civilization? Or are we going to become something else?
One point that is very much missing in a lot of this conversation is why is that happening in the first place? And one of the very, prominent reasons why we see a lot of what we're seeing is America and what it has facilitated abroad. So many of these migrants that we're seeing are fleeing wars, they're fleeing instability. and poverty that US military inventions and foreign policies have directly played a role in facilitating. So one previous example, as well as, for example, the 2003 US invasion of Iraq, it led to years of violent conflict, displacement, forced millions to flee their homes. And suddenly the US wants to ask, oh, so why do we have so many people coming into our country? Well, a lot of times they don't ask themselves the questions, what have we done to facilitate a lot of what we're seeing happen? And I think it's unfair
Right.
to.
You're absolutely right. That's true. But we didn't have to let any of them in. That's the problem. We have not been selective at all, and we haven't been thoughtful about it. And if you bring in large numbers of people that don't have education, who don't have skills, they're just moving from a society which is already a disaster in many respects anyway. They can't make it. You listen. Anybody who spends time in the Middle East understands what it's like to live in a Middle Eastern city. I mean, you can't behave in these places the way you can here. You're going to encounter all sorts of prohibitions, cultural taboos, laws, and criminality that you won't normally find in the United States. Well, why would you want that to come here? Or somebody said, well, you don't like Muslims. I said, no, I don't dislike Muslims. Well, then what's your opposition? I said, I don't want Sharia law in my country under any circumstances. We have a law. It's called the United States Constitution. We have federal law. We have state law. We obey those laws. Sharia has no place in this country. By the way, there are Orthodox Jews that want rabbinical courts. Absolutely not. Outrageous. Are we the Ottoman Empire? Are we going to run a polyglot empire where everybody has his own courts, his own representatives, his own people to try? It's outrageous. This is the United States of America. If we don't enforce our laws, if we don't demand that people behave as American citizens, we're in trouble.
But if you look at, let's say, if we're talking about law, the Constitution of the United States itself protects the freedom of religion. It protects the freedom to follow any religion you like, to dress as you wish. And if you were to, for example, right now walk into a city like Washington, D.C., LA, wherever, you'd look at people who are dressed and conducting themselves based on their own cultures. And really, the reason many of these people come to America is because it does guarantee these rights. So these people are not violating law by exercising their religion. These are rights that are embedded within the US Constitution.
The
Yeah.
Constitution was completed in 1789. I think we had 5 million people living in the 13 British colonies. We were 90% white, that is, excluding the Africans that were in the country who had been brought here as slaves. But we were 90% white. We were 90% Protestant. And this may be hard for you to believe, but the people that wrote that were trying to protect all of the Protestant sects from a state church on the model of the Church of England and the Roman Catholic Church. That's one of the reasons it was almost 100 years or more after that before people began to finally accept Catholicism as a religion, because it was viewed as political power. My point to you is the Constitution is outdated. The way we are governed is outdated. It has to be re-examined. Nobody in 1789 imagined that anybody would come to the United States except another lunatic, religious fanatical Protestant who hated the Church of England. That's what people feared. That's what they thought of. The Constitution that we have does many good things, but I would argue that the Bill of Rights is ultimately more important. The Bill of Rights is vital and essential, and that needs to be defended. But the Constitution and the way we govern and the things that we're doing, it's out of date. It doesn't fit our needs. And that's back to my comment on something given has no value. You have to earn it. And we haven't made anybody earn their place in this country. I'm talking about people like me that have been here forever. My first ancestor stepped off the boat in 1681. So we've got to get back to some notion of national service, because national service promotes national integration. It addresses some of these problems that you're discussing. Now, I know that you may not want to conform and may not want to be as I am, but I'm an American and nobody questions that. Nobody ever will. If you don't want to stand out and be questioned, then I suggest that you change your appearance, because I don't think it's life or death for you to wear what you wear.
I think this conversation is not about, how people choose to practice religion. I personally, and many who do live here who would not fit that American image that you're describing, they don't necessarily have an issue with standing out. This idea of assimilating into America, by your definition, would essentially mean me having to put aside what I believe, starting with my covering and my decision with the way I want to cover, with my religion and what I believe. And I think a lot of times this rhetoric, the reason it becomes so dangerous is because it stereotypes an entire population and saying the definition of assimilation is stripping yourself of your identity and who you are and becoming whatever it means to be American. And I think it's a little bit vague to say American values because to someone, American values might mean one thing, to someone else, it might mean another thing. I think if people choose to follow the religion that they want and dress the way that they want, is something that we're seeing across the United States and Europe, and I don't think is a negative thing, is people have the right to practice their religion so long as it's not posing a threat to others within their society. And that is a reality that Muslims and, people practicing other faiths are, living every day in, these Western countries, not posing any threats to anyone, and really practicing a religion that is, in the case of Islam, a peaceful religion, a
Well,
religion
that's
that calls
not
for
the view.
peace.
That is not the view of Europeans at all.
And that's fine. And again, just to
Well, no,
respect your
it's
time.
not. It's not fine. It's not fine because it's leading to violence that could have otherwise been avoided. You see, every great nation, every large nation can always accept some number of people into its ranks that are different from them. It's always been the case. But if you suddenly import millions, which is what's happened here and happened in Europe, then you threaten the core gene pool. What I'm trying to tell you is there's a problem. And we
And
can
I
all
don't
pretend
think
that there isn't, and you can insist there isn't, but that's the view. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to address it truthfully and openly. Stop pretending it's not a problem. It's a problem.
I mean, what's also a problem is white supremacy. And that's something that many people will not address, is you also have recruitment of extremist groups and extremist ideologies within white supremacist groups that also fit that, image that you're describing.
Well,
So I think that's
there are always fringe organizations in every society, and I can tell you that the FBI and federal police and federal marshals have really cracked down very hard on anyone that evinces any notion of white supremacy. So I think you can certainly point to fringe groups in various places, but they're not the majority, and they're not ignored. They're under surveillance, and people know who they are. So I think the white supremacy argument is frankly crap. If it were there and it were real, would you be here?
Of course. I mean, you mentioned you don't believe the Constitution, the way it's written, is relevant now, but it is the basis of law in this
I
country.
understand that, but what I'm saying is that a constitution that says that foreigners inside the United States have the same rights as U.S. citizens, which is not what the Constitution says, but that's the way the left in this country is interpreting it in order to obstruct the deportation of illegal aliens, then that Constitution needs to be changed. And there are a lot of things in that Constitution that just don't work anymore.
And we do have a process to make amendments. We do have a process to change the Constitution, and it's
Sure.
based on what the people and the officials within this country want. There's a
Well,
rigorous process.
I
Mhm.
think if you had voted, for instance, in this country in a plebiscite, do we legalize same sex marriage or not? It would have been overwhelmingly no. So those decisions are made by courts. And that's how everyone has gotten around the process that you just described. If we held a plebiscite regarding our presence in the Middle East, should we maintain our armed forces right now in the Middle East? I think you would get a no vote. What I'm trying to tell you is the Constitution doesn't work very well. We have too many people pretending to be Americans and they're not. This hybrid identity is a catastrophe. Either you're an American or you're not. And I don't think we're there, but we're getting closer to it every day. In other words, if you look at history as something that is cyclical or is a function of the pendulum swinging in one direction or the other, The pendulum swung far, far off to the liberal left. It's now swinging back to the right. And I think that's because the native populations are afraid and they want to defend themselves. They want to preserve their countries, their civilization, their way of life. And they see others who are fundamentally different from them as threatening it. And you can hire lots of psychoanalysts to come in and tell you how utterly screwed up everybody is to think that way. That's a fact of life. It's a fact of life all over the world. We have
And
to.
well, mhm. And I mean, I can tell you as well, I am a Muslim. I choose to cover, but I don't think you find me threatening. I don't think anyone should find me threatening because I follow the Constitution. I don't
Well,
put
I
any,
don't know. I don't know. You may have a gun on you or something, right?
I
No,
mean, so
I
can
don't.
you.
Yeah,
So can
absolutely,
you. And
absolutely.
the reality is, if you look at, if we were talking, terrorism and threats, I should probably be more scared from, what America has done abroad and what they have done to populations abroad, um, than anyone else.
Well, I think if you truly feel that way, then you really need to think carefully about whether or not you want to stay here. Because
The reality, I mean, this is something.
while I agree with you, I'm opposed to all these interventions overseas. I become stridently opposed to all of that. But I'm not prepared to give up on my country. I'm not prepared to leave my country over that. I am appalled at the criminality that exists today in the United States, and I think we should crack down on it very hard. Because one of the things that made us a very successful society was the rule of law. And I think that we have botched immigration badly and destroyed much of our social cohesion. We are not the nation we were in 91, and we're certainly not the nation we were in 1929 when we went into the Depression. And I don't think Americans understand that. I think Americans have this fanciful notion that at the end of the day, we're still just like we used to be. We're not. We've changed dramatically. And you have given evidence for that during our discussion.
Evidence because I say the US has sponsored terrorism abroad.
No, because of you're saying you're different, you're going to remain different, and you don't think that if that's not compatible with being an American, then the hell with it. That's what you're going to do.
Well, then what do you make then of, white American people who convert, let's say, to Islam and choose to cover? Are they not American anymore?
Listen, if they want to do that, that's obviously their business. I don't know how many are out there that do that. I
A
think
lot.
I think again it's ill advised. I think you have to hold the society together. There has to be an agreement on certain things, customs, culture, way of life. And unfortunately, if you're going to practice rigidly a brand of Islam that demands certain things, and this is why I asked right off the bat, do you support Sharia law?
I'm a Muslim. What being a Muslim means is I follow, well, the guidelines of my religion, which is a
Does
peaceful
your
religion.
religion dictate to you Sharia law?
My religion dictates to me to be a good human being, to be good to my neighbors, to be a, good member of society, a good Samaritan.
Well, if
So
that were
no, I don't
if that
think
were true,
any.
every Christian would be a saint, and they're not.
I mean, I don't think it's relevant for
I
me to
do.
come and
I
say.
think it's very, very relevant
Well,
to
what I'm
identify
saying is no
that.
Muslim who's here, and the argument I'm making is myself. I can't speak for others. I have
Mhm.
no interest in coming and saying we should be implementing the laws of a Muslim country in America. But I do think that as a Muslim, I have the right to practice my religion.
Well, we've always said Christians have the right to do many things within certain limitations. We sent the United States Army to Utah because the Muslims in Utah thought they were going to found their own state with polygamy, and we crushed it. And they either conformed or we were prepared to march in with the army and do a lot of damage. We've done this before. Now, maybe today things are different, and we will end up living in a nation that is sharply divided and may ultimately produce something else. But I'm an American. I love my country. I want to see it stay together. I'm interested in social cohesion, which means that I think our laws, customs, and culture have to be dominant. We can accept some diversity on the edges, but not fundamental division. I think we're in a state of fundamental division. So when I bring up Sharia law, I've sat in many discussions with many people that said, well, I don't care what people look like, but I do care about Sharia law, and I don't want that practiced anywhere near my family or in my country. And that's something you should be aware of. So the notion that someone can come here and say, well, that's part of my religion and we're going to abide by Sharia law, they're going to find serious resistance and opposition in the country.
And
That's
and
how,
as I clarified, I, as well as most Muslims that I know, have no interest in implementing the laws of a Muslim country or what Americans have created this, scary term Sharia law. There, we have no interest in, seeing
then I
that in a country
then
that
I would
already has laws,
would make
right?
I would make that very public, and I
No,
would.
I actually don't think there's a reason for me to prove myself or for Muslims to prove to themselves that they're not a threat. That's
Well, then
something
then you and I are different because I think right now being an American is becoming more important with each passing day, and the sense of American identity is becoming more acute every day. I think we see a country that is in crisis and conflict. We're looking for unity. We're looking for assimilation. We're not looking to divide the country.
the reason I made the argument about white Americans converting to Islam, Europeans converting to Islam, is because if we were to go by the logic that you're saying, these people are white, they look like you, and when they
Mhm.
convert to Islam, their women choose to cover and their men choose to pray, their women choose to pray. They follow the, teachings of a religion that they have converted to because they truly believe it for what it is.
I'm talking about something more broad. Religion and culture are inextricably intertwined. Separating them is very
Right.
difficult. Sit down with some Catholics sometime, and they'll tell you their greatest problem is that Catholics have over time become more and more like Protestants. Well, that's unavoidable because this was originally a Protestant country. The culture that you have here, the culture that so many people come to embrace, is a product of the Reformation that opened careers to all talents, that changed the laws. I mean, we used to have laws about no drinking on Sunday in various places. Those things have largely gone away. In other words, we've become this secular Protestant state. Now, if you're going to run up against that and fight it in some way, you're going to have a fight on your hands.
I don't think
That's
anyone's trying to fight it. And if I mean, I think this conversation is a little bit difficult because if you look at what it means to be a Muslim, for example, Muslims do not drink. If more people in this
by the
society
way,
would not
I don't
drink,
drink. By the
I
way, I don't
understand, but
drink.
what I'm saying is
Well, I don't.
Islam inherently is calling for things that actually bring more social order than chaos. If more people in this country didn't drink, we would have much less crime. We would have much less, assaults on others happening. So,
Well,
being,
if the whole world became Muslim, then everything would be better. Is that what you're suggesting?
I'm specifically
It
speaking about
sounds
your
like.
argument. I'm
And I have
specifically,
traveled in the Middle East, and I would not want to live there.
that's fine. But what I'm saying is
I'm an
most Muslims
American.
who are
I'm happy
living
here.
And most Muslims who are living here are really living by a lifestyle that is much healthier than many Americans in this country have. And
Okay. Well,
so,
look, if we want to talk about diet, we'll be here for a long time.
no,
RFK Jr.
I'm
will
not
tell you
speaking
all
about
about.
diet. I'm saying what it means to be a good Muslim is to be good to your neighbors, is to be a supporter of peace, it's to look out for others even
Well,
before looking out
I,
for
don't, I
yourself.
think you need, if you really believe that, I think you need to proselytize to a lot of Muslims
Oh
in the
no, I
world.
believe that because that's my
Yeah, but
religion.
that's your brand of it. That's
I
not
understand,
necessarily
but
what a
I'm
person.
I'm assuming
It
I'm
would be
assuming
so. I was raised as a Quaker, so nominally I'm a Christian, but I'm not going to proselytize to other people. I'm not going to tell you what all Christians think or do or behave. I'm just trying to. I've tried to tell you. You want to make the argument that everything is just fine.
I
But
don't
I'm
think
trying to
everything
tell
is
you
fine.
that things are not just
And
fine.
you're right. I do not think everything is fine. What I am saying is, I think the version of Islam that you have in your head as we're having this conversation is ISIS. And that's not a
Well,
majority of
not
Muslims.
necessarily. We saw a lot of things among people who were nominally Muslims when we were in Iraq, my soldiers and I, that were horrifying to us, that had nothing to do with ISIS, that didn't exist at that point.
Right. And so there's extremism in every religion.
That
That's a
was
fact.
extreme. This was not extreme by any stretch of imagination. It was the local culture, it was the way things were practiced. My point to you is I'm willing to believe what you say, But I have seen the world and I have seen lots of Muslims, and I don't necessarily subscribe to your view that that is universally the case.
Well, then I do invite you to read a little bit more about Islam because you will find that the true Islam is exactly this. The true Islam is being
I
good to
hear
others.
Christians all the time telling me, evangelizing Christians, Christian Zionists who are telling me what true Christianity is. So, good luck with that approach. So, I'm very concerned about where the country is headed and the consequences for this enormous thing called diversity that has destroyed our social cohesion and our internal strength. I have been a very strident opponent of colonialism. My ancestors were all anti imperialists, really, going all the way back to 1681. So am I. I don't think we have any business being in other people's countries. And if we go there, it should be on a short term basis. And I'm talking about now the government. If you're going to send military forces somewhere, let them go temporarily if they're going to assist something. But we got to get out of this business of meddling in the internal affairs of other people. And this business of liberal democracy, who are we to tell anybody anywhere in the world how to govern themselves? We can't even govern ourselves effectively as it is. That's my whole point. The truth is, America is a mess. It's not governed effectively.
One thing we've seen weaponized a lot in these conflicts is the use of the word and the label of terrorism. And as someone who has seen combat, you know what it looks like to, be in conflict zones, in war zones. I want to know your view on what it means to selectively use this term for certain groups and not others. And it's a very complicated history here because, for example, we know one very basic example is the MEK and how previously it was on a terror list in the United States and now it's not because they would further U.S. interests if they were not on a terror list. So, what do you make of this use of language when it comes to justifying, the U.S. and its role abroad?
I think it was Lincoln, could have been Reinhold Niebuhr, who was a Protestant philosopher from the Midwest. But one of them said, in more or less, that hypocrisy is a condition when vice pays tribute to virtue. In other words, we're hopeless hypocrites. There's no moral turpitude involved in anything. We dress everything up in the guise of liberal democracy. Well, it's a joke. Democracy here in the United States is increasingly a joke. I grew up in Philadelphia. I haven't had a clean election in that place in 50, 60 years. All these big cities are one party establishments. That's not democracy, that's fascism. It's all about money and resources, energy and power. That's what it's all about. So let's be honest and just say, stop the nonsense. That's what it's about. That's why we're in the region. And we've chosen our enemies. It's not as though China went out of its way to become our enemy. It hasn't. Chinese are behaving like Chinese. They've been behaving that way for thousands of years. There's nothing new in China. And for most of the last 2,000 years, China's been the richest country in the world. Gosh, all of a sudden it's rich again. Well, it offloaded communism. Good for them. We can cooperate or we can refuse to cooperate. But the notion of going to war makes no sense. But we're hypocrites, and that's all you're pointing to. So at the end of the day, I don't have any good news for you or anybody else until we finally recognize we can't afford to do what we're doing. And that's when it will all stop.
And obviously, a huge hot topic that's going down within the United States as well is the US support for Israel, which is something that has really never ceased. And you have openly stated that you believe the Hill and the White House are really captives of the Israel lobby. And something we have also seen in the past year and a half is American public opinion increasingly shifting against what we're seeing in Israel, something that previously was not happening. I believe a recent Gallup poll in July found that now 60% of Americans disapprove of Israel's military actions in Gaza, which is a really big increase from 45% at the start of operations. So we're seeing a lot of that. We're seeing people debating and contesting U.S. Support for Israel. Do you see any change in U.S. support for Israel happening if this trend were to continue? Based on talks that you've had on this issue previously.
No, And the reason is very simple. What I think or what other Americans think who are not in power is irrelevant. You have to understand that the money is on the other side. And as long as that money flows in great quantities, given the character of the people that are in government, there is simply no incentive to walk away from support for what the Israelis are doing in Gaza.
And you've been very vocal about how the U.S. in general needs to stop sending weapons abroad, and how America has essentially drained its stockpile of weapons over the past several years. You also mentioned how there's reliable sources that have told you that America has roughly like 8 days of offensive and defensive missiles on hand. And so, if this is true, why then would you say America continues to get involved in these foreign wars?
Well, first of all, there's a great deal of money behind it because we have a class of people in the United States, and of course, the New York City banking interests, as well as the London City of London banking interests, who have reasons to try and exploit Israel for other purposes. They would like to get control of the oil and gas fields in the region. They want to dominate it because the long term strategic end has always been to put China in a vulnerable position, since China is very dependent on the movement of oil and gas out of the Persian Gulf into Chinese ports. We have obviously made it very clear that we're prepared to intervene at sea militarily against China. And we wanted to make sure that we would then put China essentially in a position that was subordinate to us strategically. You've got to go back to the 1990s and look at the documents that came out of various institutions, uh, not the least of which is Rand Corporation, which is a spokes entity for the government. You had this strategy for a new American century, and you go back and look at people like Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, and a host of others, all of whom signed up for this strategy that said, ultimately, we back Israel as the vanguard for American and Western influence and power in the region, because then once we control the region, we have the Chinese by the throat. Now, I've never signed up for that because I don't necessarily sign on for the Chinese enemy picture that is popular right now, because I think it's being used as a justification to somehow or another blame China for everything that's wrong here. And most of what's wrong in the United States is our own fault. The Chinese did not rob us of our manufacturing base. We shipped it to them. And when I say we, we're back to this elite political class and what I call the CEO class, the shareholder class, the people that own most of the manufacturing and so forth in the United States, has simply said, well, the hell with this. Let's go where the labor is cheap. We can make more money. And with that, the American middle class began its path down into the hell of destruction.
Right.
That's what people need to understand. If you don't like drugs in your country, then you've got to close the borders. Now, the borders right now, the optics look great, but the drugs and the human trafficking continues to move through legal ports of entry. In other words, the legal entry into the United States from Mexico to U.S. and U.S. to Mexico, those places are still allowing this through. Why? Well, because the cartels can pay all the people that work there, that are in customs and the police entities, tens of thousands of dollars extra. So you simply, if you're getting a $20,000, $30,000 extra a month to turn the other way, people turn the other way. So we've got a lot of problems that still need to be solved. And right now we're not being honest about that. We're pretending that it is being solved. It really hasn't.
And, on that topic, we've also seen, and this is something not just the American public, but even American lawmakers and, veterans like yourself have seen, is the disastrous consequences of US interventions in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan. And, seeing these consequences, it's almost as if there's no lessons learned. And so we're continuing almost that imperial footprint abroad. Why do you think then, with Israel in specific, and we'll get into other countries as well, why then would Washington continue to pour these billions of dollars into the Israeli military? And the real question I'm asking here is what's the end goal? Because many would say, like you mentioned yourself, is this idea of securing the region, securing American interests, protecting its allies. But many would argue that it's actually not making anyone safer, especially the United States, with all the violence that's continuing to ensue, and even creating more fertile ground for the rise of more conflict.
Well, I don't know about it creating criminality here in the United States. We've done that to ourselves. I don't think it has anything to do with what's happening overseas. It's a money machine. Let's say $5 billion are allocated to purchase weapons for Israel. Now, how much of that money that the Israelis have access to ends up in our hands? Well, a lot of it, because what we've really said to the Israelis, here's $5 billion, but you've got to spend it on our equipment. That's the catch. So that
Right.
means they come and they transfer much of that wealth back to people in the United States. Now, who makes money? Where the shareholders in the defense industries, clearly. It does trickle down to some extent to some constituents that work in the manufacturing base that produces weapons. Because right now, when you ask the question, what do we actually produce? Well, we don't produce a whole hell of a lot, but we do produce a lot of military equipment.
Right.
So, it's a money laundering scheme, if you will, and a lot of that money goes into pockets on the Hill because it goes into their reelection campaigns and so forth. And they're not. It's not the only one. You have the defense complex that is got its lobbies that work in that direction. You have the Israel lobby. You have the pharmaceutical lobby. I mean, I could go down the list. It's just astonishing the numbers of lobbies with billions of dollars to buy up votes on the Hill. And that's because people on the Hill benefit from it financially. You go to the what we used to call the Banking and Exchange Committee, Security Exchange Committee. I think they have a new name now. Everybody there is heavily backed, supported, in other words, bought up by the banking industry. So the whole thing is a mess. And I don't know if we've gotten to the point where there's no one honest left, but it's getting close. So the notion that somehow or another anyone has any moral second thoughts about supporting bad things overseas, I think, is a joke. I know morality has nothing to do with it. Money is the driving force.
And that's interesting because one sentiment that we've also seen rising, not just among the American public, but also with lawmakers as well, Republicans as well, kind of questioning this unquestioned financial support for Israel, but also just why are we involving ourselves in everything and everyone's business in the Middle East? Would you say, and this is something I think is hard to answer really, but would you say then all of this is really making the region safer and making, America's position in the region, but also domestically in a better shape? Or is it kind of backfiring in your opinion?
Well, what does backfire mean? I think our intervention in Iraq was a failure. We went in 2003, and Iraq is largely a vassal state of Iran. And we've decided that Iran is the great Satan. So that seems to have been a complete failure. I don't see anything good there. The Iraqi parliament wants us to leave and has voted for us to leave the country. Uh, we're in Syria. Syria is a catastrophe. It's been broken up. Now we have radical Islamists murdering Christians, murdering Shia, murdering Druze, murdering anybody who isn't one of them. And
Mhm.
we've embraced Mr. Jelani. According to President Trump, he's a very impressive young man. I mean, that's an
With a
astonishing.
$10 million bounty on his head.
Yeah, he's a murderer. Okay, but then again, we're bankrolling the Israelis, and I think a lot of what's going on is really a function of Israel and its agents inside the United States and the enormous wealth they control in New York City and the City of London banks. And remember, there is in the back of everything, there is this business, this obsession with oil and gas in the region. So you have a couple of things going on. You have the encirclement of Iran. We want to ensure that we can encircle and strangle and destroy Iran because that's what the Israelis want. And they have spent 30 years convincing Americans that they're the greatest terrorist threat in the world, which is not true, but nevertheless, that's what they say. And a lot of people believe that. And remember, still, most Americans believe whatever they hear through the mainstream media. But you have this corridor now that runs through Syria. where the Druze are to the south, and then you have the Kurds, and then you're up to Turkey, and you have the Turks. And Azerbaijan is now treated as a platform for the projection of Israeli military power against Iran. Now, the bad news there is it's also designed to harm Russia. And by implication, this thing we call BRICS, because China and Russia and Iran are all interested in the infrastructure that is being developed across Central Asia to move oil, gas, commodities, everything you can think of by rail, road, all over the Eurasian continent. We hate that because we control the oceans. We have the largest, I don't know if it's still the largest, but certainly the best Navy in the world. Our submarine fleet is vastly superior to anybody else's, which means we can shut down all of China's ports. We can shut down everybody's ports. When you start building infrastructure that reaches all the way across Central Asia, that can go into Europe, that can cross the Arabian Peninsula into Africa, and then penetrate south into Africa, west into Africa, north into Africa, you've created an enormous problem for us because we no longer have the leverage that we would otherwise have strategically with our maritime power. So if we can split Russia from Iran, at the same time damage Iran, even to the point where we can break it up, which was always our goal with Russia, then that's what we're going to do. Is that an idea that was created in the United States by Americans? Not really. But you go back to the 90s and look at the people that were thinking in those terms. You've got to go back and look at Mr. Wolfowitz's or Dr. Wolfowitz's original memorandum that he wrote when he was working in the Department of Defense and he was under President Cheney. That's a very important document because it outlines everything we've been doing ever since for the past 30 plus years, which is intervention everywhere with the goals that I have outlined for you in mind. It treats not just everyone in the region of the Middle East as a potential enemy or direct enemy of Israel. It also sees that fight and Israel's role in it as part and parcel of the larger planetary plan to bring China to heel, to destroy Russia, and so forth. I think it's lunacy, but the point is that's what we're doing, and I don't see any evidence that that's going to stop in the near future, unless, of course, we're bankrupt, and that's a very, very real possibility.
And you're mentioning this, and this is obviously something that U.S. officials know even better than you and I. But one thing that we've also seen is this push for regime change. And you've alluded to that as well with your example on Iran. One very recent example we've seen is with Syria. But we've also seen the US, for example, orchestrate coups in other countries, overthrow democratically elected leaders, even, provoke a population in the case of Iran, for example, to get them to call for regime change. And that's something we saw recently with Israel's attack on Iran and kind of the agenda with why they did it changing every day or so. Um, so
Keep
we,
in mind something that's very important, if I can interrupt for just a second.
yeah,
All of this was billed always as this war against Islamism. But if you look carefully at where we are today, does it really make any difference whether you are a Sunni Muslim or a Shiite Muslim, or anything else to this strategy? Not really. In other words, I've been to Israel several times, and I made the points on more than one occasion to my Israeli friends, all of whom have now deserted me because of the Gaza thing, and because I don't support this Greater Israel project, which is just going to breed nothing but hatred and disaster for everyone, including Israel. But I kept trying to tell them that if you look carefully at the Shiites in Iran, they're frankly more inclined to do business with you than anybody else. In other words, there are more reasons strategically for Iranian-Israeli cooperation than there are reasons for conflict. Well, I was immediately told you're out of your mind and thrown out of the building, but it's true. The other thing is that if you look at the Palestinians, for instance, their relations with Christians and Jews over centuries were much better than the relationship between, let's say, Jews and Europeans, or Jews and others with the Turks. So, this has less to do with that. And back to what I was saying before, regional subjugation with the use of Israel as a sort of leading element or leading edge of Western international Jewish and Western capital. That's really what's happening. And so subjugating the region has the happy outcome in the minds of many of making the region safe for Israel. I don't believe that, by the way, but that's what people think. It'll be safer. And at the same time, for us to grab control of those resources that both London and we desperately need, or at least in people's minds, in order to buttress economies, specifically in Great Britain right now, but also in the United States. In other words, control the energy, and then you control everything. That's the theory. I
Right.
think that's what people miss.
Mhm.
People think, oh, well, we're against Islamism. Well, really? Then how do you explain Jelani and his behavior in Syria and we embrace him? So what's that got to do with it? I don't think it has much to do with it at all. Then, you, of course, bad news in the Arab world is you have all these elites who are only too willing to sell everybody out for money. I mean, there are no heroes in Riyadh. I don't see any heroes in the Emirates. And now we've seen the Turks, who theoretically see themselves as the sort of natural successors to the old caliphate. After all, the Ottoman Sultan was supposed to be that. And obviously, Mr. Erdogan would love that title. What's he doing? He's selling everybody out. So
Absolutely.
the only thing we can see, and then General Sisi is sitting on an explosive mine that's ready to go off any day. And his biggest concern is to stay alive and stay in power. And so he sold everybody out. And his argument is, well, if I do anything, I'll be destroyed. My country will go under. Who's going to help me? And the question I always ask when I talk to people in the region is, you talk about a lot of things that you think are unjust. You talk about things that you want to do. What are you doing? And the answer is nothing to help anybody except themselves. And I'm talking about the elites.
All right. Well, Doug, thank you so much. I'm going to leave it at that. I really appreciate you coming on TMJ.
And now I'm in
And
a lot of trouble because I'm late and I'm going to blame it on you. Well, listen,
no,
it was nice to talk to you. I appreciate it. And I hope we get a chance to speak again.
if you like what you see here at TMJ News, please like and share and subscribe to our channel for more weekly interviews and content. TMJ News is an independent grassroots media outlet based here in the US, and you can find ways to support us by reading the caption below. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode, and we look forward to seeing you for future ones.